Hello everyone. I've recently picked up learning Godot and now have about 2 months of experience using the engine. It's so strange because I've felt both incredibly rewarded and like I want to put my face through my monitor, but from what I understand, that's normal. After getting over the naive confidence from creating Frogger from scratch, see my last video for more on that, I decided that I wanted to move on to recreating another classic, Dig Dug.
It isn't termites. It isn't mice. It's Atari's Dig Dug, the earth-shattering arcade game.
Growing up, this was my absolute favorite game. We had one of those plug-and-play systems with like 100 games, and Dig Dug was always my go-to. Honestly, I would have loved to see footage of me playing that, because I'm sure I was horrible, but that game has such a special place in my heart, as it's my first memory of picking up a controller and playing games. It also seemed like a fun game to recreate because there's a lot of interesting mechanics that I figured would be difficult to develop. For those who have never played it before, you are this little Smurf-looking guy who digs and inflates your enemies until they burst? I don't know, it's a Japanese game, and I'm sure there's some deep lore behind what's going on. I guess you can look up the Wikipedia page if you're curious. But the goal is to clear the screen of all enemies before they run into you and kill you. Sounds simple, but you have things like grid-based digging, enemies pathfinding you through your maze, floating ghosts, and inflation mechanics. I can't believe I just said that. Anyways, starting off, I tried recreating some of the main sprites. This included the character, the dirt, and the enemies. Turns out the enemies have names. The cute red balloon guy with goggles is a puka, and the dragon is a Figar? I'm not an artist, so I mostly copied the base game sprites and only made a few modifications to them when I needed to. The main way the character moves and digs was one of the main reasons I decided to recreate this game. Instead of navigating through a maze like Pac-Man, you, as the player, create the maze that the enemies need to navigate through. In order to do this, I needed a few things. First, allow the player to move in 4 directions.
Wow!
And second, create diggable ground. This was an interesting thing to figure out, but the way I implemented this was by creating a signal stating that if the character entered the area of the dirt sprite, it would delete the dirt sprite from the game. Looking back, I definitely could have done this more efficiently. Having monitoring areas on thousands of dirt sprites made the game slow down significantly if I were to scale up. But regardless, for this light version I'm creating, it was perfect. Next came the tricky part of movement. You see, in the original game, the character was only able to move along a grid. If you were between 2 vertical lines of the grid and wanted to move down, your character would first have to move to the nearest vertical line and then proceed to move down. This was a little tricky to implement in game, but basically by mapping out the global position of the character and using a modulus operator, I would move the character in the shortest direction to the change and continue until I got a remainder of 0 before the character would change directions. Here's what that looks like in game. The arrow represents what direction I'm holding down. I also created the inflator bike pump? Let's call it a bike pump. Well, anyways, here's what that looks like. It's pretty buggy and can shoot through walls, but I was happy enough with it for this project. The final part of the character that's so unique to this game is how the OST works. The song in and of itself is super catchy, but what's interesting is that it only plays when the character is moving. And here's what that looks like in-game. With the moving, shooting, and digging mechanics figured out, I was ready to take on implementing the enemies. Getting them into Godot and figuring out how to inflate them was easy enough. It's a simple progression through the animation each time the bike pump collides with the puka until it bursts and is deleted. Next came Pathfinding. This ended up being the hardest part of the whole project. You see, in most games, pathfinding is simple, because in Godot you are able to set up tiles that have navigation layers, which the pathfinding agent will use to move through and find where they need to go. In a static maze, or area, this is simple enough, but when you have a dynamic maze, like the one we're creating in Dig Dug, you need to be able to implement navigation layers in certain areas only when the dirt has been removed. I'll save you the hours and hours of trying new things and troubleshooting, but the solution I came up with was implementing the same navigation tiles behind the dirt blocks, which would only appear when a certain number of blocks was dug up. I cannot stress enough how simple this solution was, but how difficult it was to get there. Literal hours of reading through documentation and searching to find the right functions and making sure that they were implemented correctly. Well, anyways, here's what the pathfinding looks like after it's been fully implemented. One problem I still ran into is the enemies are still kind of running into corners, but I was satisfied with how this all turned out. One of the really fun parts of playing the game is when the enemies turn into these ghosts who can move through walls and approach the player without having to follow the maze. It was equally fun to implement this in the game as well. I set up a timer that goes off randomly between 5 and 15 seconds, which will turn the enemy into a ghost state and will navigate through the walls to the position the player was at right before they turned into a ghost. Once they reached that position, they returned to their regular state and continued the chase. The last part of the game was putting in place some final touches. I simplified the level, added lives, a fail state, and a win state. When you win, you get the classic Dig Dug sound. Now I know there are a few mechanics from the original game that are not included here, including the fire breathing from the Figars and the rock dropping when it was dug underneath. I unfortunately ran out of time and didn't get the chance to implement them, but I'm really happy with how this light version of Dig Dug turned out. Let me know what other games you'd like to see be recreated. I'm still very much in the learning phase of game development, and will probably create a few more videos like this before I move on to some of my own projects. But if any of that sounds interesting, or if you've made it this far into the video, consider subscribing. And with that, have an amazing rest of your day.